Right, I think we can get going now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome back to the BSHS Digital Festival for the History of Science 2023. This session is the Imperial Railways and their Legacies roundtable. And the format of this is going to be a series of lightning talks, so some short papers, which are going to come from our wonderful researchers and experts. And then we're going to follow with a more broad discussion where people are going to pick up on some themes from those papers. Do please use the Q&A to ask questions. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce this panel today. The idea of hosting a discussion which is basically focused on decolonising railway history and heritage, came about because of our companion panel on Monday, which was New Tracks on the History of Railways, where we would more broadly discuss how we can engage more publics with railway history. And also, this is obviously the British Society for the History of Sciences Festival. So we wanted to show how some of the approaches and ways of working with public history that come along with researching railway infrastructure and railways in general can be applied more widely to the history of science, technology and medicine. Well, this panel, on the other hand, is a little more specifically concerned with Imperial Railways, although colonial legacies of the railways certainly cropped up in our first panel, mainly thanks to the input of John McGoldrick. So after you've watched this, do go back and watch the recording of the first panel, please. That is the joy of our wonderful online digital festival. So I've brought together some scholars and researchers with a really varied backgrounds, because I think it's so important that we hear multiple voices and different perspectives on railway history and heritage, and value people working in adjacent fields. So it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome, and you might want to, can my panelists please open their cameras so we can see your wonderful faces. Hey, hi everybody. Hello. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Adonis Li, whose doctorate focused on the history of the Kowloon-Canton Railway and its relationship with government, society and the built environment. I'd also like to welcome Matthew Calloway. I don't know if you want to give a little wave. Obviously everyone's got their names on the internet there. So Matthew is an independent researcher exploring the history and memory of railroads in the southeastern United States. I'd also like to welcome Priyanka Panjwani, who is a conservation architect. So she'll be giving us that kind of professional perspective on railway heritage. And I know Priyanka from, she was one of the contributors, as was, I believe, everybody on this panel except for our final panelists were involved in a Twitter conference called New Tracks and the History of Railways, which was one of our 2020 virtual experiments in public history. And last but not at all least, a relative newcomer to railway history and heritage is Will Law, who's a PhD candidate with the National Railway Museum and the University of Southampton. Will's research examines the regional politics of the East African Railway network during decolonisation. So what we'll be doing is I'm going to ask each of our speakers to talk for 5 or 6 minutes about an area of their research they'd like to share with you today. And then we're going on to some discussion points. And I believe in some of the lightning papers, people are focusing on these themes already. So we'll have hopefully a really fruitful discussion afterwards. But I think that's enough talking from me. I would like to firstly introduce Adonis. Would you like to go first, please? Let's...
Sure, thank you, Erin. I'll just share my screen now. Right. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending this, and thank you for those of you that are joining afterwards on the video as well. And also thank you to Erin for organizing, putting this all together, and to Matthew, Priyanka, and to Will for joining this I think it's going to be a really interesting roundtable. So, like Erin said, my name is Adonis Li. I'm currently at the University of Hong Kong, though I will be joining the University of Lincoln in the near future. I did my PhD in Hong Kong on the Kowloon-Canton Railway. So this picture you see here is a War Department austerity locomotive arriving in Hong Kong after World War II. In the background is the Kowloon Terminus's clock tower, so a little bit more on this later. So the Kowloon-Canton Railway, or the KCR, was very much an imperial railway. It linked the British colony of Hong Kong to a planned trunk line through China to Beijing. The newspaper cutting on the left is an editorial taken from the colony's leading English language newspaper on the railway's opening day in 1910. Though it wasn't actually that successful, since the trunk line wasn't complete until the 1930s. The extent to which the railway did help British interests is debatable. So I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion here, if you don't mind. On the article on the left here, I showed how Britain was able to essentially force an autonomous Hong Kong to buy British trains from Metro Camel, which was a manufacturer in Birmingham. But in the article on the right, I showed how the KCR by the 1970s earned most of its profits from helping the People's Republic of China to earn precious foreign exchange. So there was this railway, ostensibly part of a colony, but it was actually helping another regime to bolster its economic interests. So there's kind of a tension, and things are less straightforward than they first seem. And certainly it's a little bit different to the sort of resource extracting railways that you get elsewhere throughout the British Empire. Although it is remembered as an imperial railway. So on the right, I was with that purveyor of Imperial Railways, Michael Portillo, and on the left is a travel poster from the 1960s with the railway terminus front and center, and you can see this clock tower sort of in the background there, and that really plays a part in the memory of what was the Kowloon-Canton Railway here in Hong Kong. The railway is now a part of Hong Kong's famous mass transit railway system, or the MTR system. Often kind of wins plaudits as like the best mass transit system in the world, or the cleanest, etc. The MTR company now has important links to the former Imperial Metropole. So the Elizabeth Line, or it used to be called Crossrail, in London, this is now being managed by the MTR Corporation. And also Hong Kong's new masters, the People's Republic, now exports its railway technology across the world. There were even rumors of it bidding for HS2 contracts, although state media quickly denied that. The first roundtable on railway history mentioned Derby, and the British Rail Research Centre in Derby played a part in Sino-British or Chinese-British railway diplomacy as well. So the two countries signed a railway cooperation agreement in the 80s and identified the Kowloon-Canton Railway as a potential collaboration site. The PRC quickly shared its Derby discoveries in its railway journals. But British Rail eventually realized that its dreams of selling consultancies and designs to China were not going to be realized. And one company, Doughty Hydraulics, had its designs copied and sold at a cheaper price by Chinese manufacturers. So, and now China obviously does a lot of projection of railway power across the world. So the legacies of this one Imperial Railway, the Kowloon-Canton Railway, in East Asia are complicated, and it's entangled in geopolitics and diplomacy, and the memory of this railway too is entangled in colonial nostalgia, as well as using the past to criticize the present. Lots of really sort of matters to do with politics and societies of present day and how they affect the memory of this railway. So that's all I have time for, and I'm really looking forward to the roundtable. So I'll hand back to Erin.
Wonderful. What a succinct introduction to such a complicated situation. I'd never even really thought about the term railway diplomacy before. But obviously, yeah, the power dynamics there, like you mentioned, the geopolitics, is definitely something we can come back to. So what you can do, the viewers who are watching us live, is if you do have questions for panelists as we're going along, by all means type them in the Q&A and we'll get back to them in the general discussion. But for now, I'd like to say a big thank you to Adonis for starting us off with a brilliant paper. And next up, I think we'll have Will Law. Will, could you start sharing your screen, please?
Yes, thank you. Does that work? Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So my name is Will, and I'm doing a PhD at the University of Southampton, and it's a collaborative PhD. So I also work with the National Railway Museum in York. My PhD looks at railways in East Africa during the end of the British Empire. So Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania from 1945 to the mid-1960s. Today, I'm going to talk about a side project that I'm working on with a colleague at the Science Museum. And the project looks at the history of this Rhodesia Railways carriage that entered the National Collection in 2005. And I'm going to do this by a concise biography, which will be under 5 minutes long. So the carriage was built in Birmingham in 1927 before being exported to Rhodesia, which is present-day Zambia and Zimbabwe. It entered service as a first-class coach, and we don't know exactly where it operated, but we think it operated on the main line between Bulawayo and Mafeking. Later on, so by 1971, it was retired from Rhodesia Railways and was operating on the Zambezi Sawmills Railway. The Zambezi Sawmills was just north of the border between what is now Zambia and Zimbabwe. The sawmills harvested teak, which you can see on the bottom left-hand corner of this photo, and it used old railway carriages to transport workers from one end of the sawmills to the other. In 1974, it came to the attention of wildlife artist and conservationist David Shepherd. He was gifted a locomotive and a carriage by then President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, and he made a documentary about its return to the UK. And I'm going to show about a minute of that now.
I heard about an old steam engine in Zambia that needed saving and felt that I just had to rush out and bring her back to England. This marvelous coach, it was a 1927 built, actually, in Birmingham. Beautiful coach. To this day, it's complete with all its green leather bunks and perfect condition with its lovely mahogany paneling and all the rest of it. It's an ex-Rhodesia Railway sleeping car. And it still had the notice in the loo telling you not to expectorate and you mustn't spend more than 10 minutes in the laboratory. And I've just got to take it back to England. It'll be unique.
So spoiler alert, he takes it back to England and it ends up here at Whipsnade Zoo at the back of this ensemble. And here it takes on a new identity. So it becomes labelled as a David Shepherd exhibition and the carriage itself becomes a museum. So visitors to the zoo can enter the carriage and view a photographic exhibition of its return to the UK. It remained at Whipsnade Zoo until 1990 and it had a series of other homes until it entered the National Collection in 2005. In 2008, it was restored and it's due to go on display at the National Collection Centre in Wroughton in 2024. So here it is peeking out of the back of a load of cars and buses. Questions are, now it's going on display, what stories do we want the carriage to tell? For example, if it did operate on the Bulawayo to Mafeking line, was it part of apartheid arrangements in South Africa, whereby passengers of this coach or Black African passengers of this coach were forced to change into segregated coaches at Mafeking? The restoration process also revealed other information, such as graffiti from this individual named I. Adams, and the carriage also seems to be kind of two carriages put into one, because the running frame is different from the actual carriage itself. So there are plenty of questions that we have about this carriage that we don't know, because its narrative has been dominated by the story of its return. So I will end on that point with the carriage heading off into the snowy Cumbria Mountains. And thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to discussing this in the roundtable.
That's just brilliant. Thanks so much. I'm always absolutely fascinated by object biographies, and that you've created like an object itinerary, tracing its whole life as far as you can with the information available. And yeah, and then the other thing that the kind of railway, which is now a Railway Museum exhibit, was at one point hosting another exhibit. So that gets a bit kind of Russian dolls of railway history there. So thank you so much, Will. That was an amazing contribution. And again, we'll come back to some of the things you've raised there. Next, we'd like to hear from Priyanka Panjwani, who is a conservation architect, to get a conservation perspective on some colonial heritage in Mumbai.
Hello, everyone. Greetings to all and good morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you're joining today. Thank you, Erin, for inviting me today to be part of this roundtable for a discussion on railway heritage in this digital festival organized by the British Society for the History of Science. My name is Priyanka Panjwani, and I'm a conservation architect from Mumbai, joining you all today from Hartford in Connecticut. A little bit about myself. I've loved the railways as a mode of transport, and I've used it a lot as a child and an adult in Mumbai, India, and overseas. I'm a rail enthusiast, and I've developed an ongoing interest in researching industrial heritage and railway histories for a few years now. However, I don't consider myself an expert, and I'm always looking to learn new things. So I hope to share things today that I've observed through my studies and engagement with passionate people in the Railway Enthusiast Society in India, and with two inspiring women, Molshi Joshi, the coordinator of the National Scientific Committee on Industrial Heritage and Tiki in India, and Vinita Srivastava, the executive director of Railway Heritage in India. There are four themes to this discussion, and I'd like to base my talk on the context of India and Mumbai, and the practices of heritage conservation, its positives and challenges within the country. India was a colony of different European empires, mainly the British, who ruled from the 18th century until independence in 1947. It was during this time that the British introduced new technologies such as telegraph, railroad, and steam transportation throughout the region. The expansion of the rail network across the Indian subcontinent was an important means of collecting and supplying raw materials such as cotton and opium across Europe. The rail network in India has advanced many fold since then, and now India is the fourth largest rail network in the world, after the US, China, and Russia. It is difficult to encapsulate the history of Indian railways in 5 minutes, but I've tried to do that with this timeline of key events that, according to me, give a nice overview of changes in the landscape of Indian railways with the onset of Industrial Revolution. From a good carrying system to a passenger one, its expansion across the nation, centralization and electrification, the impact of two world wars, and the partition of the country. We see the modernization and unification of gauges, along with UNESCO inscriptions of the railways, and finally the Hydrogen for Heritage project in recent times. These are the many journeys that the rail industry has taken in India. In the last 170 years, since the first train ran in India, there have been a wide variety of different resources and assets that the railways have accumulated over time. They are heritages of the industry and legacies I believe must be preserved and adapted for future generations. The assets can be classified as tangible and intangible. Tangible heritage includes historic locomotives and livery, historic buildings, stations, workshops, sheds, bridges, and tunnels, historic landscapes, industrial archaeology and objects, oral histories, folk art, music and culture, and which is intangible heritage, and also design, engineering, and construction skills. The railways in India have inspired many different narratives and built connections within the minds of the Indian people. The journey of the railways is deeply embedded in the historical journey of the nation. Some of these narratives are those of associations of important national figures, geographies of infrastructure and technology, stories of regional politics and migration, birth of the new nation, princely states and lifestyles, amalgamation into the center, luxury and tourism, popular culture, railways and film, literature, music, and the stories of rural towns in India and traditional art and representation. Moving on to the next theme, I would like you to read this quote, which says, Indians regarded the new phenomenon of the railway with awe. P.N. Kabraji recalls that most of them would not believe at first that this strange locomotive called the steam engine could be a product of human skill and science. They saw that no horses or bullocks were employed to draw the train and were convinced that the white man who could work other miracles had employed some demons or other invisible powers to draw so swiftly and easily the enormous land of wagons and carriages. There was no other way to account for this wonder, and so they brought proprietary offerings of coconuts to unearthly power and were ready to worship it. The third-class carriages were originally most uncomfortable, not being provided with seats. The windows were barred and were so high that only those who were tall enough could have a lookout. They were aptly styled bakra gadi, for they were little better than cattle trucks. When thinking about what it was like for the natives when the new steam engine, or Aag Gadi as they called it, meaning fury car, passed through their lands, I find this quote very interesting, taken from one of my all-time favorite books on Mumbai and its heritage. I was watching a TED talk about decolonizing museums by Hannah Mason McLean, and she explained that decolonization is all about breaking the power play of two things, knowledge and space. The idea of the white man being able to perform miracles seems a bit of brainwashing through knowledge dominance. The space of third class shows just how people were treated during colonialism. Within the railway sector, there are many clues of breaking these silos of or power plays of knowledge in space. These are efforts to make railway heritage inclusive and barrier-free, also colorful and vibrant, as colonial aesthetics are sometimes considered dull. These are including women in the Rail Nari project and bringing uniformity in design as seen through newspaper reports. There are even reports of Mumbai local trains being replaced with new Vande Bharat trains with no different class coaches, only special coaches. In order to truly represent local cultures, the efforts by the railways could be amplified by acknowledging the displaced natives of the land on which the rail lines were laid, a practice that I see a lot in the US. The citizens may have been scared initially, but they embraced the Indian railways and their assets wholeheartedly. Even the British built structures like this one. Maybe because they see their own ancestors in the stone carvings of the erstwhile Victoria Terminus, for example. The students at Sir J.J. College of Arts were instrumental in creating these carvings. And so, as an alumni, I certainly value this. Also, as a conservation architect, I value traditional craftsmanship, which is so difficult to recreate in today's time due to lack of skill, material, and money. Coming to the topic of memory, our lives are filled with so much data and content that we look towards repositories to help us remember things that we care about. The most common repository is, of course, Google. And the Heritage Directorate in India has been doing great work in aiding memory by feeding the Google Arts and Culture platform with so many stories about journeys, people, heritage, and engineering. Apart from that, Ms. Vinita Srivastava gave a talk on the ICOMOS forum about how railway archives are being digitized and how they can help people understand politics, economics, urbanization, and trade, among other things in connection with the railways. The good news for railway enthusiasts is that heritage assets have been inventoried by the Indian National Trust on Art and Cultural Heritage, and it is a good start to preserving these for future generations. And I hope that individual states take ownership of them in collaboration with the central department. We have all heard about how visuals help in memory. It is great that you have images or objects that you can see and travel back in time. On the left is an example of the popular cultural narrative of the Indian Railways, commissioned as a wall mural in the Rail Museum in New Delhi. It reminds people of their beloved movie star portrayed as a common railway man. We can relate to him. On the right is the historic facade of the 1930s built Mumbai Central Railway Station. It is painted with Art Deco motifs with colors that do not signify the Western art movement, and in many ways undermine the inherent value of both the structure and the intended outer layer. In the words of the author and architect Mustansis Dalvi, who wrote the article, one of the city's iconic facades has been dematerialized, indeed vandalized, by ignoring the original architectural intent, aesthetic choices, and style. Mumbai Central is not an Art Deco building, nor is it common canvas to paint upon. These are contestations when the larger public is not consulted about decisions made for buildings that they feel are their own. And as a conservation architect, I am deeply concerned about the reversibility of paint on the historic facade. The downsides of the speed of urbanization fell through these reports that show neglect and demolition of some of the historic railway assets over the recent years. On the other hand, there are also efforts shown for preservation of railway stations and creation of rail museums in the country. The Rail Enthusiast Society, through their talks and conferences, are making efforts towards sensitizing people about the legacies and shared memories of railways in India. They're women people, and I enjoy being a part of that group. Along with that, the Heritage Directorate of the Railways has constituted several policies and guidelines for the conservation and preservation of rail heritage. And the Indian Railway Stations Development Corporation has created codes for the use of railway heritage assets and development of the railway lines. Here, heritage assessment, conservation and reuse plan, and management and maintenance plan are made necessary. The Indian Railways are also working towards net zero by 2030 through a host of active and passive methods for environment protection, seen on the handbook on the website. So all these, according to me, give hope for a bright future of the Indian heritage of the Indian Railways. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I love the positive ending there. There's just so much to talk about. You've managed to cover so much ground there. But I was absolutely fascinated to hear about this tension between the changing to the tangible exterior of that railway station, which was to tell a story and counter a traditional way of presenting it, but then that actually poses huge conservation challenges. So that's definitely something, those kind of disruptive acts of cultural heritage is something we can discuss further. Thank you so much, Priyanka. So last but by no means least, we have Matthew Calloway, who he is a independent scholar, but has done extensive work and public engagement. So are you ready to share screen? Over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, let me get it up here. All right. Thank you, Erin. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. First, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional lands of the Catawba, Chiraw, Sugaree, and Waxhaw, and pay my respect to elders both past and present. Here we have the Norfolk and Western Railway as it existed in the 50s. From the port of Norfolk, Virginia, the railway's main line headed west through the Appalachian Mountains to industrial cities in Ohio. Other lines radiated north and south, including from Roanoke, the railway's headquarters. The N&W's flagship east-west passenger train was called the Pocahontas. With declining demand, the railway modernized the train in 1969. And for publicity, a woman in costume posed for photos, which appeared on timetables, menus, and souvenirs. When I learned about this event, I thought a broader exploration of the railway's appropriation of Pocahontas was needed. There's been some excellent recent scholarship on railroads and indigenous people in the U.S. West. For example, Julia Lee's examined the Santa Fe's depictions of the chief as linking native bodies with the land and promoting that railroad's passenger service. But the N&W hasn't received the same attention, and the Pocahontas also appears to be the only U.S. passenger train named for a specific indigenous person as opposed to a tribal name, and one of just a handful named for women. The Pocahontas dates to 1926, when the railway held a naming contest with a $25 prize and received thousands of entries. The choice of winning entry aligns with the railroad's ties to Virginia. And what we see here is the romanticized Pocahontas of white settler society who saved John Smith from being killed by her father, Paramount Chief Powhatan. This isn't the Pocahontas of the sacred history of the Mattapony, kidnapped and sexually exploited by the English settlers to exact tribute. 20 years later, the railway held another contest for a new day train on the same route, and the winning entry was the Powhatan Arrow. Here we have the railway visually juxtaposing indigenous technology, the bow and arrow, with streamlined passenger trains. Images like this are examples of what Kevin Brunel calls settler memory, a process that invokes the memory of indigenous people while disavowing the history and presence of settler colonialism. But the N&W's appropriation of Pocahontas actually predates these trains. In 1881, a Philadelphia banking syndicate, C.H. Clark and Associates, formed the N&W by purchasing an older bankrupt railway that they hoped to extend into the Flat Top coal region. In 1883, the first extension reached the town of Pocahontas, Virginia, at the center of the Pocahontas coal field, overseen by clerk associate and railway executive Frederick Kimball. So why did the railway uproot Pocahontas from the Tidewater region and transport her to the Appalachian Mountains? In 1949, the railway president, Robert Smith, offered this anecdote to the Newcomen Society, embracing the language of discovery to describe Frederick Kimball's survey of the region in 1881. According to Smith, Kimball wanted to name the 12-foot thick coal seam for his wife, but she suggested the mythical Pocahontas instead because the land evoked early colonial times. I doubt this is true. The story echoes themes that were common in 19th century Appalachian travel narratives, which cast the mountain region as a strange land inhabited by a peculiar people. Mountain residents were seen at times as representatives of a pure Anglo-Saxon Elizabethan culture preserved by geographic isolation, and at other times as degenerate hillbillies unsuited for assimilation into modern America. Kimball didn't discover the coal seam either. It was already documented in surveys, and a local blacksmith was using coal to fuel his forge and selling bushel baskets to area residents. But the railway's backers sought large-scale coal production. As they were extending railroad lines to make this possible, the Clarks and their London investors were acquiring mineral rights from mountain farmers, typically below market value. They amassed rights to hundreds of thousands of acres through a separate company that in 1901 became a railway subsidiary called the Pocahontas Land Corporation. Mine operators leased this land, and the railway shipped Pocahontas coal for both domestic use and export. The NNW's visual depictions of Pocahontas imagine a romanticized landscape and sanitize the messy realities of industrial coal production. In addition to linking Indigenous bodies with land, these visualizations substitute Indigenous people from another region to stand in for the more problematic contemporary residents of Appalachia. Other contemporaneous advertisements show the railway marketing its region as a land of plenty, ripe for industrial development with room to grow and an abundance of coal. And as Leo Marx recognized, these themes were integral to imperialist discourse at the time of English settlement. So to wrap up, industrialization didn't solve the perceived problems of Appalachia. The region's struggles were enabled and exacerbated by railroads like the NNW. A critical evaluation of the railway's appropriation of Pocahontas through the lens of Indigenous history and recent scholarship on railroad colonialism also exposes tensions between narratives of technological innovation and ideas of progress.
Thanks so much for that. Absolutely fascinating, and what rich source material as well. Well, for us as historians to analyse the advertising from the 50s. So much to discuss. I think we should perhaps launch straight into discussion. So thank you again, Matthew. Absolutely brilliant research. So we've kind of broadly thought about 4 themes for this roundtable. That kind of tied everybody's work together. So the first thing we were thinking about is journeys as both a kind of method and a methodology to approaching our histories and stories. So I'd like to invite, maybe Will can start us off, because I think journeys really underpins how you've been analysing the use and history of your railway carriage. Would you like to maybe come in and talk about that, please, Will?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. So the carriage, we've been looking into the history of the carriage, and our findings are that really this journey of the carriage back home has become the only thing it's associated with. And that's partly because of David Shepherd and his fame among railway enthusiast circles. But this story has kind of dwarfed everything else, and so the journey is really all we know about, and we know that through David Shepherd's memoir and from the documentary. But what we're really trying to get at is the story behind the journey in the 50 years before that journey happened. And it's really hard to untangle where that journey has come from. Is it a longing for British steam, but the fact that it's a Rhodesian Railways carriage, is there also something about empire in there as well? And that's something we're really trying to unpick and get to the bottom of.
Absolutely. That is kind of the processing of decolonisation and exploring the transition from British Empire to Commonwealth. Definitely, I think, is a subtext which is relevant to several of these case studies. And so that's really interesting. You've kind of flipped it. You're saying, like, actually, we know the most about the journey. But with a lot of objects, and I think a lot of railway objects in science museums, it's actually sometimes the more mysterious part. But because you've got Shepherd as this heroic figure in the narrative, that's what's held. Would anyone else like to come in on the theme of journeys? I mean, Adonis, you talked about how the Elizabeth line was actually, we've got this kind of flip of technology being imported in to Britain from a former colony. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's the really easy way to sort of frame the Elizabeth line being ran by a former, people from a former colony. There's a really easy way to frame it, which is British decline, which is to say that, oh, look, Britain can't even build and manage some railways anymore. It has to get people from the Far East to do it. And it kind of leads, and then on the flip side, there's another really lazy narrative, which is to say that, oh, this is the rise of East Asia and the rise of China's soft power in terms of technology and infrastructure. I think, especially as historians, it's I think we should try and steer, to use a journeys related metaphor, to steer away from these sort of lazy narratives and to actually look into the more whether it's historical or social kind of aspects of it. I just wanted to talk a bit about the Rhodesia Railways again, which with this carriage. What I found really interesting was that, like Will says, we know a lot about the journey, as in that one specific journey of it, being repatriated. But then I think it's really great that museums are trying to get at the sort of everyday journeys that the carriage is making, rather than just the one really famous one. So I think within the framework of the journey, it's really interesting how we're now moving towards more I guess everyday is a bit of a loaded term, but sort of everyday versions of it.
Absolutely. I think these stories of use and the user perspective opens up all kinds of avenues for decolonizing history, very broadly speaking as well, not just our specific research interests. Those user narratives of the technology is where we can find the stories. Although I appreciate in Will's case, it's so frustrating we don't know who did the graffiti. If only we knew. But there's lots of different ways to analyze that act using academic methodologies. Would Priyanka or Matthew like to come in on just the theme of journeys before we move on to some more specific questions?
I'd just like to say that I totally agree with Adonis and you when you said the user narratives. And I'm not a historian, but it helps me really much to understand the importance of railways. And I'm in touch with railway enthusiasts and actively discussing day-to-day events. They're as excited about history as well as what is happening in the current time. So it's quite exciting. Thanks.
Yeah, I think my presentation sort of talked about journeys of discovery in a sense, especially with Frederick Kimball, having to travel deep into the mountains to find this coal, and it's sort of wrapped in an imperialist narrative of sorts. So I think that's another component of this theme.
Absolutely. And I just think something to do when we think about the power source, and you talked about the journey to get the coal, the energy transitions seem to be a theme as well throughout the different papers. So it's not actually one of our talking points, but if anyone would like to add any more to that, speaking to their papers. Priyanka, I noted that you talked about the Indian Railways sort of prospect of net zero. But I also saw on one of your slides that the heritage railways are moving to hydrogen power. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I read a report that said that they are trying to run all the heritage steam locomotives on hydrogen power in the near future, and that is interesting. Although some people may say that it will take away the charm of the steam coming out and the noise and things like that. But yes, I believe as a conservation architect, you don't just look at these active methods. You have to look at it holistically, sustainability at least. You have to look at all your heritage assets in terms of reuse and adaptive reuse. And I feel that is being a little bit not focused on greatly at present. But yeah. But there is a real push to move towards better sources of energy for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting as we think about decolonizing history that we've got the narratives, the progress narratives, and the kind of positive views of imperialism that come through on, for example, you know, the advertising and the way that the PR agencies in the interwar railways and post-war railways are presenting themselves as pioneering in technological terms. It's really interesting, I think, to compare and contrast that with how we're presented as a public with current trends towards green technology. Not that I'm saying green technology is, I'm not being critical of this, but I think we could look at the communication of the new technologies in a similar light. And a couple of you have alluded to the kind of colonial narratives bound up in these. So decolonisation, I appreciate actually we're a little short of time for all four of our bullet points. So decolonisation kind of underpins all of the work that everybody's working on, because you're all critiquing narratives and who's telling the stories and whose stories are being told. But I'd like to invite you to just talk for a couple of minutes about what decolonisation means in your particular context, because I know it's a very kind of broad term that will mean different things in different professions and different geographical contexts. So who would like to go first?
I can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, no, I'll let Matthew.
Well, I think one methodology that I try to use is sort of cultivating eBay as a kind of archive for obtaining the types of materials that I'm looking at. You know, these are train ephemera. These timetables and advertisements and annual reports weren't made to be archived and weren't made to last. But they've become collectibles, and there is a collectible market for them. And so I think eBay is really the best source for trying to gather this type of material that's not otherwise found in archives. And, you know, particularly with social media, you know, there's avenues to try to digitize and share some of these types of materials and tell broader stories about the way railways were presenting themselves and the types of narratives that they were employing.
Would you like to come in on that, Adonis?
Yeah, just on the decolonization point. Decolonization is a particularly tricky term in Hong Kong because it's quite fiercely debated over what it actually means. Technically, according to some, Hong Kong was never a colony because it was ceded by what some in China call the unequal treaties. So the term itself is contested. In Hong Kong, there's quite a bit of colonial nostalgia. So whereas in some contexts, I understand that it could be very easy to just critique colonial administrations. In this particular context, sometimes when we critique them, we get supporters of colonial administrations saying actually things were pretty good back then. And there's a lot of, and I alluded to this in my paper, there's a lot of using complimenting or praising the past in order to critique the present. So it's quite a messy sort of area. As for my own kind of research and practice, I try to steer away from kind of really, really contemporary debates, and also to try and just stay grounded in the sort of sources that I have access to, the sort of narratives that I think historians should be taking part in, rather than sort of forcing any evidence into one particular narrative or another. So that's kind of how I try to sort of think about decolonization in my own work. And just to add to the complexity of this particular context, that unlike other colonies, Hong Kong was given to another power instead of standing on its own. So there's quite a lot of entanglements and annoying situations to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Because on an administrative geopolitical level, you've got these different definitions between, I suppose literal decolonizing, has that even taken place because of the transfer of power, versus our kind of more broadly culturally constructed ideas of decolonizing. I mean, to me, I talked a bit about peopling in the first panel. To me, it's like peopling the story, but in this instance, it's trying to take down that power disadvantage of the colonized and the colonial administrators. That's just my view. I appreciate I've not been a very timely chair and hurried people along, so discussion time is quite short. So I'm just going to field a question from the Q&A box, and if anyone else would like to throw in a Q&A question, get them in now. So we have a general question for the panel from Mike Asbester, and he says, these are challenging aspects to all of these subjects. Thanks, such an interesting panel. Can anyone comment on how we might address difficult aspects of imperial legacies in public discussion and interpretation?
Can I go?
Go for it.
I'd just like to say that on our way to address these difficult things, we must try to look at all sorts of information that is available. In my practice, when I can't access reports or newspaper articles about a certain site, I tend to look on YouTube and look at blogs of people walking through these spaces sometimes. I enjoy doing that and seeing the space through their eyes and try to understand what they might enjoy in the historic site or value it for what they value it for. So just looking at things holistically is what I think is an approach. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? How we can bring these quite nuanced and deeply richly researched areas of railway history, but as we've discussed, because of the complexity of what decolonizing means to different people and nostalgia. Adonis, our next point was going to be memory, and I think you've really highlighted that. There's a significant role of nostalgia, and Matthew's source material with the kind of romanticized Pocahontas perfectly exhibits how strategies of publicity and communicating railway narratives to the public for a very long time have been embedded with a rose-tinted view of the past. I've got another question. I'll stop talking about nostalgia. So John Carroll says, thanks for the great papers. These railways and their legacies raise some questions about home. For example, does a railway line, which we'll discuss, belong in a post-colonial world?
Thank you for the question. That's a difficult one to answer. It's a very good question. I believe the line, so the Sawmills line still exists, but I think that it's mostly used for excursions now for tourists. That's the only evidence I've seen of it being used. And I believe that old Rhodesian railway stock is used for that journey, so similar to the coach that was brought back to the UK. In terms of how that's discussed in relation to some of the things we've talked about today, that would be quite a challenging one. But I suppose the legacy of that carriage is tied up in what's been left behind by that railway line and the sawmills that's kind of picking itself up and moving somewhere else, or dissolving, or whatever happened to it. So I think the lived legacies of these lines are just as important as the stories we tell on the museum floor. If that answers your question, sorry if it doesn't. Hopefully someone can pick that one up.
You make an excellent point. It's, I think, one of the most pertinent things about studying railways is their presence in the popular imagination now, and the continued use of many of the lines that we're talking about, even if a company's gone bust, or technology's been superseded, people still have a lived imagined experience of these places, and it's how to connect those with the past I'm grappling with a word for less nostalgic. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, and we'll just have a couple more minutes of discussion on the memory theme.
Yeah, I think the memory part of it and the nostalgia part of it is what, kind of going back to Mike's question, often makes this difficult. There's a lot of people who are still fans of railroads like the Norfolk and Western. And, I think they have a very rose-colored glasses view of it. And so pointing out narratives like what I've tried to do today are not always well received, as well as just sort of the general sense in the United States. I think folks here don't really view America as an empire and imperial, and it's very hard, I think, to educate people. So I think trying to open minds with stories like this may help people to see broader narratives of imperialism beyond railways.
Excellent point. Yeah, it's that I think almost everybody's touched upon this kind of some level of resistance to seeing more nuance to these stories. And I feel quite strongly it's to do with how embedded the positive views of railway technology are in the different national contexts, actually. I don't know if anyone would like to come in on that. We've just got a couple more minutes. Okay, no one's jumping for that, and I appreciate we're a little short on time now. So the final point we were all considering when we were developing the roundtable was this idea of technological progress that hangs over industrial history and heritage. And railways kind of hold this really particular and peculiar place in the imagination, whereby they both represent the old and the good old days, but can be heralded even now as a sign of a symbol of innovation and progress. So that tension is potentially at the heart of why it's difficult to, in public communication, decolonize railway history. Has anyone got anything they'd like to share from their work or comment on with regards to modernity and progress?
I think, like I said earlier, I find some of these tropes to be so kind of lazy when we're sort of discussing histories, and or even just discussing railways in the contemporary era. So, like, one example I'm thinking of is, and Matthew probably knows a bit more than I do, there's often these pictures of high-speed rail development in the US, and then juxtaposed against high-speed rail development in China. And there's always this kind of underlying thing of saying, oh, look how these formerly backward countries are doing compared to what we should be doing. And also in the UK, all this all the debates about HS2 and all the debates about other kind of rail projects in the UK, there's often this kind of unspoken or properly spoken narratives of decline. And again, I just find these to be pretty lazy, and I try my best to kind of avoid them in my own work.
Just picking up on that, I actually wonder if it's the simplicity of these stories that is why they hold such a mass appeal. So it's kind of an easy bit of history to remember. And and you were saying about the lazy storytelling. I mean, oh my goodness, in the UK, there's so many documentaries that are just rehashes of previous documentaries about how great British railways are. And there was a Portillo reference earlier, wasn't there? No, you know, people are very welcome to enjoy those documentaries, but they often retell the same stories over and over again. And it's almost like comfort TV, I think, in the UK. I can only speak to that particular context, but that's the impression I get. Would someone else like to come in on the point of modernity in progress before we wrap up?
I think even in India, we see the same stories being repeated, like you said, but there is a huge rush towards modernization and introducing make in India or indigenously built locomotives and indigenously built other library. So, but in this space, we should not forget the past, is what I feel. It should be a balance of both in some ways, and we need both, right? We can't do without one. It's what I feel.
Yeah, again, that's a really great point. And I think I alluded to in the first panel, again, linking the two panels together, that if we can just kind of harness that passion and enthusiasm that a kind of existing railway heritage interest group have, and kind of introduce different ways of looking at the railways, almost a kind of bottom-up way of public engagement, maybe, you know, empowering people to enter archives and understand materials themselves, and kind of like Mike's project, the Railway Accident Project, where you get kind of citizen historians and citizen archivists helping with digitization and stuff. It's almost like if we could just harness the energy and enthusiasm for the more comfortable side of railway history, we can introduce them to difficult stories, but that, you know, really need to be kind of grappled in the public consciousness to help people understand actually the true picture of what was happening in, for example, the 19th century with Imperial Railways. We're about a minute away from time. I'd like to just thank the panel so much for your contributions. I think they've been absolutely fascinating, and I would have loved to have an hour on each of your papers, but I know that I'm sure we'll work together again in some capacity, and I'd just like to thank you all for joining us. And thank you for everyone who's joined the live streams on Zoom and on YouTube. I'm sure you share a collective virtual thank you to the panelists. And I hope you've enjoyed the conference. I can't believe we're on the final day of our DigiFest, and there's more to come this afternoon. Go to the events page and join the final couple of talks and the pub quiz this evening, most importantly. So thank you once again, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.